clicked on record also. Great. A very good afternoon to everyone. The participants in WebEx and the participants in YouTube. I welcome all of you to this institute lecture by Professor Gautam Desiraju. It is indeed my honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker. Professor Desiraju is a structural chemist who has been in the solid state and structural chemistry unit of the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru since 2009. Prior to this, he had been at the University of Hyderabad for 30 years. He has played a major role in the development and growth of the subject of crystal engineering. He is noted for gaining acceptance for the theme of weak hydrogen bonding among chemists and crystallographers. His books on crystal engineering and the weak hydrogen bond in structural chemistry and biology are particularly well known. He has won international awards such as Alexander von Humboldt, Forschung's Prize, and the Traas Award in Chemistry. He has edited 3 multi-author books in solid state and supramolecular chemistry. He is a member of the editorial advisory boards of Angewandte Chemie, Chemical Communications, and Journal of the American Chemical Society. He is a former president of the International Union of Crystallography. He is a recipient of an honorary doctorate degree of the Universidad Nacional de Cordoba, Argentina, and of the Rayalaseema University, Kurnool. He was awarded the Acharya P.C. Ray Medal in 2015 of the University of Calcutta for innovation in science and technology. He was awarded the ISA Medal for Science of the University of Bologna for the year 2018. At present, he is the chairman of the governing council of Bose Institute, Kolkata. He has formerly been the chairman of research councils of National Chemical Laboratory, Pune, and the Indian Institute of Chemical Technology. So with this introduction, I request Professor Desiraju to deliver today's institute lecture. Professor Desiraju.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anil Kumar, for your introduction. I'm happy to be speaking under the auspices of IIT Roorkee, and I was requested to speak on a topic which is related to Indian science and China. So this is a fairly significant question today, because China is a very important concern of India. And many activities within India need to take into account the China factor. Science is no exception, because science and technology are a very important part of India's progress itself. So how much do we take into account China when we plan the research and development activities within our own country? Now, I'm not really talking about individual researchers planning their individual research projects, because at the individual level, one is of course aware that China plays a dominant role in world science today. But you can't really be cognizant of China all the time when you are planning your individual research projects. So that is not what I'm talking about. I am talking here about the overall strategic plan that is made by the government of India and also by private industry in India in planning and strategizing their research, whether it is government or whether it is large industry or even medium and small industry. These parties have to take China into account. Because if you don't do that, then the chances are that a lot of your efforts may be misdirected or they may even be neutralized. Now, China is not just another neighbor, it is a very powerful adversary of our country. And over the last 60, 70 years, ever since the Chinese Communist Party took power in China, 1949, which is just 2 years after we got independence, they have not lost any attempt to undermine India and to undermine India's interests. Of this, there is no doubt. And it is interesting to seek causes for this. So, in the earlier part of my lecture, let me tell you what is my plan for the next 1 hour or so, 50 minutes to 1 hour or so. I'll give you a short background on why possibly there is some degree of antagonism between India and China today. A general background in terms of geopolitical realities as they have been changing in the world. This is higher than science. This is an overall scenario. And then I will take up quickly 3 case studies. And they pertain directly or indirectly to chemistry, but it could be any subject. And the level of chemistry that I will talk about in these 3 case studies is something that anybody in any branch of science, or for that matter, even outside science, would be able to follow quite easily. I choose chemistry because it is my subject, and I have looked more closely into these chemistry aspects vis-a-vis China. I am sure a similar set of examples could be found in physics, biology, and other subjects too. Because the domination of China in scientific activities is quite huge. Today in the ISI journals, I think they actually publish more papers than the USA. So I think they have taken to the #1 position. And India and other countries are all far, far behind. So let's not make any, let's not have any illusions that this India and China are comparable as far as science is concerned. We are not comparable. Now, that is the first part of the talk, and then the second part would be the case studies. And then the third part would have to do with what Indian S&T managers, both in government and industry, should try to do. What are the sorts of things that can be done realistically in a reasonable time frame? And how does, it's not just a question of controlling China or preventing them from doing some things. How do we actually become better? We don't want to be in any holding pattern here, but we would actually like to be better. It's, just mere survival alone may not be enough. So this is broadly 3 parts of my talk. Now, let's take the first. Once again, in more detail, why is China important for us? Now, over the last 25 to 30 years, we have seen the emergence of a different basis for the classification of countries in the world, a better word than country actually is state. And the normal way in which, they say the world has got about 200 odd countries as defined in a political map. What is the meaning of this term country? Most of these countries are defined on the basis of what is called the nation state. The nation state is a concept that started in 1648 in Europe with what is called the Treaty of Westphalia, and it was further refined in 1815 in the Congress of Vienna. And pretty much in the 19th century, this concept was used all over Europe. So broadly, a nation state means a state whose geographical limits are determined primarily by ethnicity. So, see, any country, if you want to, any country in the world needs to be stable, there has to be some basis for this statehood or nationhood or whatever it is. All the people within that nation or within that state have to feel something common among each other, and they should also feel that they are somehow different from anybody else in some other state or some other nation. So if both these conditions prevail, then you have a stable nation state. Now, the ethnicity is not religion. At the first, it should be known. I would request people to switch off their mics, please. Ethnicity is not religion. And this is clearly brought out in the way in which geographical boundaries changed in Europe. Let us say over 150 years from 1800 to 1950. Ethnicity was a very strong reason for the formation and the non-formation of countries in Europe. Some typical examples of when countries were artificially put together. For example, Czechoslovakia after the First World War was actually two ethnicities, the Czechs and the Slovaks. So the arrangement lasted for about 80 years and then it came apart. Yugoslavia was put together after the Second World War, but there were 4 or 5 ethnicities there and it barely lasted 30-40 years. The ethnicities then split apart into their individual countries, which were all nation states. So nation states can be small or slightly bigger to be stable. Also, through this process of formation of the nation state, especially in Europe, there was gradually a beginning of adherence to certain basic things like a democratic form of government, that is people voting freely for the government of their choice, respect for the rights of individuals, certain human rights, dignities, and so on. These actually originated in inspiration from France and the USA, which had even come earlier to all this. And it was gradually associated as being the dominant form of definition of a country after the Second World War, especially, and the domination of the USA in world affairs. Now, this sort of a situation went on for a while, but things were changing. It was not very sure. The idea of the nation state itself is not very old. The human race has existed for much longer, and we have had systematic governments and other forms of governance for at least 2,500 years. So compared to that, 100, 150 years of the nation state is not a long time. And with the end of the Cold War in Europe, there was a breakdown in this general scheme of things, and a new and important idea arose, and that is the idea of a civilizational state. Now, this civilizational state actually is the wording of a very famous academic in USA called Samuel Huntington. And he wrote a very fine and well-cited essay called The Clash of Cultures in 1993, and that subsequently became expanded in the form of a book. Now, what Huntington said was, and his article was inspired by the emergence of Islam as a major force across many countries in the world. So he said that he was projecting a sort of clash between Islam and the Western world as it existed then. Now, this clash has not happened. Actually, I don't think it has not happened in the way in which Huntington might have predicted. But he said that in the future, various enmities and clashes between people would not happen because of economics, but it would happen because of cultural differences. Now, culture is a very broad term. It includes tradition. It also certainly includes religion, because in most parts of the world, the culture of a country is strongly influenced by the religion, but it is not exclusively a religious matter. So basically what he said was that you are going to see the emergence of nations which will be called civilizational states. They are rooted in a particular civilization. In other words, based on tradition, habits, culture, religion. In fact, to put it briefly, the very way of thinking. And he was very clear on one point, and he said that this is something that is going to replace the idea of ethnicity as a basis of nationhood. Now, the idea of a civilizational state has gradually taken over after 1993. And today we have certain examples. Normally, you would say, the way I've defined nation state, this is easier to apply in small countries. When you have big countries, the chances are that there are going to be many ethnicities. So ethnicity can no longer be the basis of big countries. And in fact, 3 countries where the concept of the civilizational state has taken root are China, India, and Russia. And all these 3 countries in their various ways have been trying to find their way towards this kind of an idea, whether it suits them better. There are 2 more countries which can be added to the list that are not so big. One is Turkey, and the last one, strangely enough, is the USA, which is also maybe trying to find the basis of its nationhood. You have the emergence of, especially the election of Donald Trump in 2016 brought many of these things to the fore in America. Putin has recently declared that it was a hopeless venture of Russia to try to integrate itself with Western Europe, because he said that we are actually Eurasian by blood and culture. And he says that is the real Russia. Now, this is not a lecture in political theory, but in science. So I'll come back to the topic. The reason why I believe that the rivalry between India and China is increasing rather than decreasing today is because here are 2 very big countries which are civilizational states, or becoming one. The only difference between India and China is that in China, the government of the day actively acknowledges this and does all its strategizing on the basis of the fact that China is a civilizational state. In India, because of our baggage of 1947 and the constitution, the government of the day has always been fighting shy of this idea. Now, why do I say fighting shy of this idea? Why do I feel that India may move towards becoming a civilizational state? I mean, I am a scientist, so I will not do theorizing like humanities and social science people. I will look at data and evidence. If you look at the general elections in India from 1950 onwards, you will see that, well, 52 was the first election. 52, 57 and 62, one party got an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. After that, except for the very, very peculiar election of 1984, which was largely caused by a sympathy wave, no party has secured an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha till 2014. Now, this is very significant. Finally, the Lok Sabha elections, more than anything else, give a feeling for the way in which people are thinking. So it means that our electorate was playing with all sorts of things between the 1967 election and the 2009 election. All kinds of permutations, combinations were tried, which means the people of this country didn't really know what they were, because if you know what you are, only then you will get an absolute majority. Somebody will get an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha who is somehow articulating this feeling the best. So whatever it is, one party in 2014 was able to articulate some idea of India that found a resonance with a very large number of people. You don't worry now about different states and this and that. Whole country. That is why I'm only talking about Lok Sabha. So which means that when we get this absolute majority, not only was it obtained in 2014, an even larger majority was obtained in 2019. So this means that people definitely are beginning to feel that the model of India as enunciated in the 1950 Constitution is not the best way for them to express themselves. Otherwise, they won't be voting otherwise they would never have voted with all kinds of coalitions and so on for 50 long years. Nothing was satisfactory at an all India level, which means that this is a firm evidence that India is moving through the democratic setup to a more civilizational way of looking at itself. And because India and China are both civilizations, the antagonism will start. Huntington's clash of cultures. Now, to advance, any country needs money and power. More money gives you more power gives you more money. So it is a self-sustaining cycle. Now, the great advantage of civilizational states whenever they have existed, I mean, let us take India in the ancient days, China throughout its history, is that in any civilizational state, this is very important. Strategic interests always come above economic interests. In nation states, economic interests come above strategic interests. So, if you look at China's policy with regards to CICENTE, they keep strategic interests in mind, temporarily shelving their economic interests even. And any country that prides itself in being a civilizational state will automatically start getting used to the idea of long-range thinking. See, in India, we think extremely short range. In fact, it is pointed out that in nation states, The thinking is only, 5 years if the term of the elected representative is 5 years, or it is 4 years in America when the president is elected for 4 years. So people cannot think for longer time scales than that. Whereas a civilizational state doesn't have that. We can think back about 3,000 years. That is our time scale. So if your time scale is 3,000 years, then you can afford to do a lot of long range thinking. And this is what you need today in India in S&T. And that is why I have spent so much time in discussing what the civilizational state is. Because it is this mindset of being a civilizational state and taking pride in the fact that we are a civilizational state that will automatically and normally and smoothly lead us into long range thinking. The 3 case studies I will now come to, which show that China has been indulging in such long range thinking right through, even when they are poor. Remember what I said, in a civilizational state, strategic interests always come before economic interests. Very difficult for us in India to appreciate this, because all of us want to make money. But this is not true only about Indians. Everybody in the world wants to make money. People in China want to get rich. It is the approach towards making money. We are happy to take a short-term approach. Tomorrow they will say that if I pass a certain exam or get into a certain college, if I pass a certain exam and get into a certain job, so that's enough for me. That's an example of short-range thinking. Because you do certain things for some immediate short-term gain without realizing the long-term consequences of doing this. An Indian who studies very well and does something will quite cheerfully go and settle down in America. That's an example of short-range thinking, because immediately it looks nice, it looks rosy. The long-range consequences are what will happen to you in a very strange and different foreign country after 30 years, 40 years. It's fine for you, but your children will grow up as foreigners to you after some time. Have you ever taken that into account when you went off to America so happily? And so this is exactly what I mean. So now it's a scientific institution, so I'll take up 3 scientific examples reasonably quickly. The first concerns something which is also very well known topic in the general public, and this is what is called the rare earths. The rare earths, and the chemistry students and other scientists, I think any science person would know that they are a set of closely related metallic elements which wherein the chemistry is very, very, very similar. There are 14 of them, and beginning with cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, promethium, samarium, europium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, holmium, erbium, thulium, ytterbium, lutetium. So you see, even after 50 years, I'm able to remember this lot in correct order, even though my research hasn't had anything to do with rare earths. Now, names apart, because they are so similar to each other, their importance, their only difference, because these concern slight differences in what are called F electrons, which are very deep inside the electronic shells of the atom. So the only major differences you find among these 14 lanthanides are in the region of optical properties and magnetic properties. And because the elements are very close to each other, in fact, this is the only case in the periodic table where a group of two elements, Jodi, is given one name, and these are praseodymium and neodymium. They are so close to each other and they are always found together, so that Jodi is given the name didymium. And didymium is not an element, but it is, for all practical purposes, it is used like an element name. And it's a very important constituent of certain glasses, glasses that people wear, welders or something, to prevent their eye from getting a glare from the welding beam. Other kinds of glasses which are used for vision in the night. Today in the Olympics, we will see swimmers wearing certain goggles which have strange colors. Many of these things have different rare earths in them. And because I said the optical properties are all slightly different, they are used for various kinds of lenses, filters, glasses. And each of these lanthanides is unique. You cannot substitute one for the other. You can't make a car without a rare earth, cerium. You can't make a smartphone without a rare earth, europium. You can't make a color TV with the red color without a rare earth. Can't. No other element can be used to substitute. And above all, one of the most important ones, I've already mentioned it, is neodymium, which is an essential component of permanent magnets, very strong permanent magnets, which are used in all kinds of applications for guided missiles, sensors, GPS, any kind of a thing where you need to track something down. Anybody who is getting power from a renewable energy source, it has to go through something that involves the rare earth. At a familiar level, anybody who's using a cigarette lighter, that is got a rare earth, which is again unique. So they have very widespread uses, important, not important, critical, strategic, and no country can do without them. The other strange thing about rare earths is that they are not really rare. If you mean that, they are not found at all, they are found everywhere. And again, just like other minerals, the chances of finding a rare earth or any mineral in your country depends on the area of the country. So it's a statistical thing. So which are all the large countries in area in the world? China, Russia, USA, Canada, India, Brazil, South Africa. So you will find that these 7 countries keep appearing in any list of most minerals. It's one or the other. Now, so there's nothing great that the rare earths, the ores exist only in China or something like that. Nothing like that. They exist everywhere. And in fact, till about 1980, most of the rare earth production in the world was monopolized by the USA and to some extent Australia. Then came Deng Xiaoping. Now I'm coming back to civilizational state and long-term thinking and planning. He made a very famous statement. He said the Gulf countries have oil. China has got rare earths. And China was not a very rich country in 1980. They started a long-term plan right then and there for rare earths. And you see the way they do it. This is their typical business model. They first locate the ores. Australia, America, and all have done it. In India, we have not even begun to bother to locate where these ores are. Some have been found, some have not been found, but there's plenty in India. Actually, the most common of the rare earth cerium is very plentiful. the essential component of motor cars. And there is a lot of it in India too. We don't know where it is. Some we know, but in China, they located the ore. Then the second part, all these rare earths are found as oxide. So you have to make the oxide into the metal. And so this involves some sort of a metallurgy, which is always messy. And in the case of rare earths, it's especially dirty. So they did much of their metallurgy in remotely populated areas of China, like Mongolia and all that, Xinjiang. Not many people live there. So they did all this dirty work there. A lot of pollution. And in the early years, they don't care what they're polluting, what they're doing, rivers, oceans, everything. So they started doing the metallurgy. They also brought in foreign companies. They're very good at doing that. I told you sometimes they take an economic knock. They paid a lot of money to some of these people. They told all the foreign companies, you please come. You set up the business here and you start doing. So they started extracting the pure metals, which is very difficult. The prices of rare earths, by the way, are sometimes unbelievable. Lutetium is more expensive than gold. You won't believe. You know, the price of lutetium is something like $700,000 to $800,000 per 1 metric ton. It's huge. Some of them very costly. Some are quite cheap. Cerium, samarium are all quite cheap by other standards. But and the cost comes because of the difficulty in separating the pure metal. Lutetium, for example, is very difficult to separate from ytterbium. So to do that, it costs a lot of money. Now, so they got the metal, pure metal. Then they did the next thing. Using the foreign help, they started making the final end product. Magnets in the case of neodymium, sensors, devices, phosphors in the case of some of the others. So the final end product they started making. And at that time, rather abruptly and suddenly, they started throwing all the foreign companies out. They have already taken all the expertise from them. So they said that unless only China will export, we will sell to you. You don't do anything. So one way or the other, they got them all out. And at that point of time, when you've got the ore, you do the metallurgy, you get the metal, then you make the finished product, then you sell the finished product to America, Japan, any country in Europe, Germany, which needs all these things to make their goods. So what do you have? You have a monopoly over the whole cycle. A to B to C to D, ore to metal to finished product to market. So you control the entire supply chain, which is very good economics. And you have set up a monopoly for yourself in these things, for these essential things. And then they do geopolitics, geostrategy. Japan and China have always had this scrap over some islands in the Pacific, which is separating their maritime borders. So Japan tried something in 2010 and immediately China stopped the export of rare earths to Japan. So the cerium oxide, which is normally about $1,500 per metric ton, it suddenly went up to $100,000 per metric ton in that 1 year. Imagine how much money the Chinese made by just blocking the supply to Japan just for that 1 year. After that, it has come down again to the old level. So you can play ducks and drakes with prices once you have a monopoly. How many countries now they'll start shouting and saying, you know, this and that, you can't do this. But you know, finally they have got the stuff. And the other countries, USA and all that, even lost the ability to extract these rare earths, and they have got all sorts of other problems, which we will have tomorrow in India. Environmentalist groups, activists, tukde gangs, you know, all these people will come. And then, you know, it will be very difficult to do some basic things. The Chinese, you know, they can do all this. Now, Australia has started, you know, it's a very nice technique that they, you know, call it because Australia has suffered quite heavily at the hands of China, especially after they joined Quad and all that. It's called recalibrate and decouple. So they said that we will not, it will be a little painful for us, but we will do without China. So they took some of their ores again in Western Australia. There's a company called Lynas. It is the only company outside China that is commercially making rare earths and all today. They've got the biggest plants in Malaysia, and then they do all their processing there. And China now is in a very happy condition because it is even taking the ores from countries like India and processing now. So it becomes a total route for all the other countries. So the rare earths is one example why I mentioned it is long range thinking, which puts a country into a very advantageous position so that the other countries are so far behind that even to catch up with them is going to take a very long. Now, the second case study has to do with the pharmaceutical industry. After COVID came, people started saying, so many of our medicines we are importing from China. This is true. We import the drugs, the chemical compound called active pharmaceutical ingredient from China. And we do what is called formulation in India. We make tablets and syrups and, ointments, make injections. All these things, that is called formulation. We can't make the original compound itself in India because it's too costly. Once again, this is a place, this is even more sad than lanthanides, because India had the capability of making many of these common medicines. Today, common medicine like crocin, metformin, atorvastatin, that so many people are having, millions of people are having all these medicines. All these medicines are imported, the compound is imported from China. We are only making the tablet here. So, India is, they say pharmacy of the world, I'll say India is compounder of the world. We are neither able to make nor do anything because it is too costly. Same method, what I told for rare earths. They control the entire supply chain. A to B to C to D. So these drugs and so on are made in 2-step, 3-step, 4-step, 5-step routes. So they will first catch one first step, A is to B. They'll start doing that and then they do something counterintuitive. I told you they lose money also. They will price the product cheaper than the starting material, which doesn't make any economic sense. The product B will be made cheaper than the starting material A. No Indian industrialist will do this because he will get so scared that he's losing money for 5 minutes that he won't take a long-term view. And why do they make the product cheaper than the starting material? They're not stupid people. Because tomorrow B has to be made into C. So when they, firstly, then you lose, the competitor like India loses its initiative to make B from A. That expertise is gone. Then they will make B into C. Then suddenly they will make C very cheap and B very costly. So then there's no motivation to make C also. So you lose that expertise. So A is to B is to C is to D is to E, like that 4 or 5 steps. Systematically, each step they will play with the prices. And finally, when you have knocked out all the competition, then you have got a monopoly again. Today, our imports from China in the pharma area are about 90%. We only make 10% in India today. 90% we are importing from them. Whereas India's share of their exports, that is, as a percentage of all their exports, how much are they exporting to India? Only 15%, 1.5. So the moral of the story is they don't need us, but we need them. Now, many of the things they do in China, many people were scared. And they said that, oh, tomorrow China will stop the export of their drugs to India. And then we will be suffering. We won't have medicines. I take a different view. I don't think they will stop their exports to us at all. what they will try to do is they will try to buy up our pharmaceutical companies, because that suits them better. And this brings me to another interesting topic, which I think we must think about when we discuss China or want to study China. There's a very famous book written again about 2000 years ago called The Art of War. It's by a Chinese person by the name of Sun Tzu, Suntzu. Art of War is a very small book. I think it's about 60 or 70 pages. That's all. And it talks about the various ways in which you can wage war. And for example, some of the memorable things he says there is that, the best kind of victory you have is a victory which you get without losing any men. So how do you do that? How to destroy the mind of the enemy before the battle. He tells all these things. And one of the things that Sun Tzu says in his book, he says that if your strength is 10 times greater than the enemy, you surround him. If your strength is 5 times greater than the enemy, you attack him. When your strength is 2 times that of the enemy, you divide your forces into 2. And he says, if your strength is equal to the strength of the enemy, he says, then you run away from that place. So please look at it. 10 times surround, 5 times attack, 2 times divide your forces. Equal strength, you run away. And I will put Indian pharma in 10 times as strong. So roughly the number of plants they have is about 8 or 9 times what we have. So a very simple estimate, and their plants are also bigger. So definitely not even 10, maybe 15 times also they are bigger than us. Their pharma industry is bigger than us by 15 times. So there is no need for them to attack us by denying us their exports and all that. No need. They will only surround us, because they will get what they want without doing anything. Just buy up our companies. What else is left? And I've mentioned this Sun Tzu example because I want to come to the third and last case study, where it is 5 times, and so they attacked us. This concerns the notorious case of the Sterlite industry in Tamil Nadu, and the fact that Indian copper production suddenly fell precipitously. This was a case of an outright attack, which means they didn't feel as strong vis-a-vis us as they felt about pharma. Now, what did they do? Before all this Halla started, India was a net exporter of copper. Copper is a strange element. It's essential, obviously. It is essential for anything to do with electricity and the transmission of electricity. So once again, with the whole world moving towards renewable energy sources, where the electricity has to be carried to places far away from where it is generated, you need a proper supply of copper. Now, the case of copper is unusual. Many of these big countries, big in area countries, don't have so much copper actually, except the US. Notably, China, India, Australia, South Africa do not have that much copper. Copper is found in great quantity, the ores, in certain very strange countries. You will never believe. Peru, Chile, Democratic Republic of Congo, Philippines. I mean, who will imagine that these are the countries where they have a lot of copper ores, good ones. So most of the people in India also was importing copper ores from these places. Yes, there are some copper ores in India, roughly in a horizontal line somewhere between Rajasthan and Jharkhand, but it's very poor quality. And to start extracting copper from that is a headache. So usually you import the ore and then you put a smelting plant on the sea coast, because that is the cheapest way of bringing the stuff. And so they set up this Sterlite plant. Sterlite is actually very old, about at least I think 30 years plus it is. It was set up with a lot of support. And every government in Tamil Nadu, whether it is DMK or ADMK, have supported this Sterlite plant when they were in power. And they have always opposed this plant when they are out of power. So there's nothing strange in that. That is a typical Tamil Nadu politics that has been going on there. So it was set up with government support, and it was taking care of 40% of India's copper needs, just that one plant. Very important element, very important metal. Not only that, we were exporting, and we were exporting to China. So for all their capacitor needs, they were importing copper from India. India was a net exporter of copper till the Sterlite problem began. So how did they attack? They could have picked any metal. Actually, they can play the same game, same strategy with any key metal that India was making, but they chose copper, I think, for many reasons. Compared to many states, you see how carefully they study us. We hardly study them at all. How many of you even know the provinces of China? Nothing. We don't know. We are so much worried about some small things in India, but we don't know. They know. They know that Tamil Nadu is one of the easiest places to start a riot. Because all the elements of instability are there. Firstly, the governments, they are two sides of the same coin. And they will talk all sorts of things, their usual stuff. And they also found out that there is certain weak points in Tamil Nadu, that cultural aspect. There's also one more thing I should tell you, technical point about copper metallurgy. The ores of copper are the sulfides. So any copper plant will generate sulfur dioxide in the metallurgy. It's very common throughout the world. And any place which generates sulfur dioxide anywhere in the world has a nice pollution control facility, because you cannot have sulfur dioxide, spewing out into the atmosphere anywhere. People will choke and die. So you can't have that. The sulfur dioxide also has a good economic advantage because it is used to make sulfuric acid, which is also an extremely important commercial compound. So the sulfuric acid business in Thoothukudi, the place where the Sterlite plant is located, was actually quite a flourishing business, the byproduct of the copper metallurgy. This pollution thing, they got a handle. China got a handle. And maybe they made some mistakes. Maybe certain things, some pollution things leaked out. Copper metallurgy also could involve a certain amount of arsenic and all leaching into the soil, but there are standard methods of controlling this pollution. It need not have become like this, but this being India, maybe these pollution lapses occurred. So then they caught hold of all these, what Prime Minister has called Andolan Jivis. And mostly this consists of the church groups, which are very strong in that part of Tamil Nadu. And then there is Islamic groups. The connection between the church groups and the extreme Islamic groups internationally is very well known. You have something called the Global Foundation, which is a very old evangelical group in America, which has formed a basic collaboration with a group in Sudan, extreme Islamic group called Islamic Research Foundation or something. So these two have got together. Now, whether they came together even in Tamil Nadu or not is a moot point, but the fact is that the church and the Islamic extremists have worked together elsewhere in the world. So you have people like this Mohan Lazarus and Seaman and all these characters roaming around. And you see, once again, it is for giving small amounts of money to DMK and ADMK or any political party, it doesn't matter. These people will keep quiet because the governments are weak, the parties are themselves weak, the people are volatile. You just say a few words about Tamil is greater than Hindi, or Brahmins are very bad. You can say anything you want, but you just say a few words like that, you can start off a whole agitation there. So they know that this is a very volatile state where it is very easy to start off something. So the rest of it just works like a computer program. The Andolanjivs came, they started shouting, environmental groups, go there, Supreme Court, close it down. So the whole thing suddenly comes to a dead halt. So dead halt. Now they only want to open it up. And they're too scared. Everybody's scared. Some Tamil Nadu election. I don't want to offend the DMK. I don't want to offend the ADMK. Some short-term gains. Once again, China could take a long-term view. And when the Chinese can attack you and kick you, they know how to kick you very badly. So India, firstly, the copper production stopped. We had to start buying desperately from anywhere. Second, they put in a lot of money into mines in Balochistan, which is part of Pakistan, which is also part of the same copper belt I told Rajasthan to Jharkhand. That same thing continues in Sindh and especially Pakistan and Balochistan. So those places were opened up. And above all, Pakistan is exporting copper to China, and Pakistan has become a net exporter of copper because of all this. So not only have they deprived India of a lot of control and strategic advantage, but Pakistan has also become a beneficiary. So Chinese, as they say, they know how to kick sand in your face. And we have all been very quiet. Oh, Supreme Court, they said like this, that fellow, something environmental, we'll have a rally, DMK, ADMK. We think at a very microscopic level when those guys have got a big plan. So here, this is a case of outright attack that the Chinese have done. Now, in the last few minutes, I will come to the final part as to what we can do given this kind of a scenario and given this kind of an enemy. First thing is we have to understand China. There are cultural differences. We are very emotional. They are not emotional at all. We have to cut this emotion. Today, in a few days, you will see, we'll get some 2 or 3 medals in the Olympics. They'll get some 56 or 60 medals they will get. And then we'll say, oh, why are we not getting something for 2 days? We'll say, then again, for 4 years, we'll forget. And then once again, we'll start the same discussion. China was not getting medals in the Olympics 30 years ago. They didn't have rare earths 30 years ago. They didn't have pharma 30 years ago. They never had copper then, and even now they are still importing. But at the same time, they're given a royal kick to India at every stage. Whenever they could get the chance, they planned and they did it. Now, as I said earlier, the strategic interests must come before economic interests. Most of our companies and all that, they go for immediate short-term gains. They're too scared to do anything else, and I don't blame them also. Tomorrow some policy will change, some new fellow will come and sit in the ministry, something else will happen. They cannot even afford to take long-term decisions because our governments only last for 5 years. So ek din ka raja, so he will go, tomorrow somebody will come. So which company can take these kinds of decisions? The other thing we should also try to understand is figure out our role between US, India, China. Because whether we like it or not, in about, I would give it 15 years, we will definitely become the third most important, third most rich, and third most powerful country in the world. It will be a poor third compared to USA and China, no doubt. But still, third is third, gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal. At least bronze medal definitely milega humko. This is something that most people are willing to admit, and this is when I mentioned money. It is not simply in purchase parity terms, but in absolute terms. People say that by about 2030, we will get a per capita GDP in India of $4,000 per year, which is considered some kind of a watermark, because that means that everybody in India will pretty much be able to buy all the common things that they need. So India will become there. It is definitely, we are heading towards this number 3 thing. But if we are number 3, we have to understand number 1 and number 2 very well. And I don't know which will be number 1 and which will be number 2, but we will leave that question. So whether it is planning the scientific things, planning our resources, planning our strategies, we have to do it only this way. Firstly, there is no excuse to not improving our science. Our technology is bad in India because our science is bad. It is not at a standard. Please don't kid yourself with all these things. The budget of the 3 science departments put together today is only about 15,000 crores per year. You know, it is a very, very, very small amount. And industry also is hardly putting any kind of a thing in basic research or any kind of R&D also. There's some sort of an imitative thing going on. So we are not, you know, whether you look at pure science, applied science, it's like the Olympics thing, you know. हम कोसोवो को 1 मेडल मिला, बल्गेरिया को 2 मेडल मिल रहा है. Still after so many days today, India got the 2nd medal. Everybody is jumping up and down. Oh, so great, so great. Next time we will do better. No, next time we will not do better. Because basic attitude is not there. And as I said in the beginning of the talk, the positive side is that finally Indian people seem to know themselves better, slightly better than before. They are not so totally confused as when they were voting, 17, 18 parties into power. They are voting at least one party into power. Forget the states. I'm only talking about the central government because only that matters for overall strategic concerns of the country. Madhya Pradesh has no strategic concerns. And West Bengal also doesn't have any strategic concerns. Kerala certainly does not have a strategic concern. India has a strategic concern. And so unless Indians as a whole lot of us know who we are, we cannot do Olympics properly, we cannot do industry properly, we cannot do science properly, we cannot do anything properly. So that then is the basic lacuna, and which is why the present time is so important and interesting for us at a time when, and this is not really a political statement of any kind, it is a geopolitical reality. Unless a people know themselves, the country cannot prosper. Today it can be this party, tomorrow it can be any other party. Don't get confused with these parties that may be or may not be in power today. All their function is to convey in terms of policy and execution what the people of the country really want. I think all of us want to see a very strong, prosperous and powerful India. We don't want to see, something like this, that we are seeing in Olympics today. And then we don't like it. It's not nice. None of us likes it. We are supposed to be so big. We are supposed to be, so important. The second most populous country in the world. I have given you 3 examples today. In the case of the lanthanides, we weren't even there in the race. In the case of pharma, we were there and we lost it. And in the case of copper and sterlite, they came, attacked us and destroyed us. So I think I should stop somewhere around here. And with the general plea that, the negative side I have said, the positive side also I have said. That this is a country that is beginning to realize itself. And once it realizes itself completely, countries in the world have become powerful. whether it was Germany and Britain in the 19th century, whether it was USA and Russia in the 20th century, now China in the 21st century. Countries have become powerful when they had a very clear idea as to what they are. Today, the US is going through a crisis. It doesn't know what it is. That country is split down right in the middle. And when a country doesn't know what it is, its decline is inevitable. And this is true not only of overall situation, but definitely true of S&T, because S&T is such an important part of a country becoming both rich and powerful. No other area can do both these things. So no matter how much we do diplomatic efforts, Ministry of External Affairs, multipolar world, nuanced approach to China, something happened in Bhutan, none of this is going to work if the basic thing is not correct. Basic thing is we still don't know whether we are a nation state or a civilization state. And I think that is the bottom line of what I have been trying to tell you. There seems to be a move. We at least seem to know there is a general feeling that the existing system, the existing constitution of 1950 has not served our people well. The potential, capability, talents, industry, energy, hard work of the Indian population is much, much higher than the level of the constitution and our leaders today. And I think that is the challenge which all of us as individuals and as groups shall have to understand and try to overcome. So thank you very much. I hope the next time I talk to you, I can talk with a nice background, which is from India and not from China. I put this picture here today because I had taken it myself. This is in Beijing, just outside the Forbidden City. So the photograph is about 10 years old. I don't like to put photos which I have not taken. So I took this photo. So I thought I'll put it today. Next time, who knows, 10 years from now, I'll come and give a talk with a background of India where we can talk about how India has done very well. And, you know, not just stayed in the same position, but taken an offense and shown other countries what we are really capable of doing. Thank you once again, all of you.
Thank you very much, Professor Desiraju, for a wonderful talk. Thanks for highlighting the importance of having a feeling that we are part of a civilization state. Why it is important to feel like that? For long-term thinking, this kind of feeling plays very important role. And then the level of science and technology in our country. And as a country, we should know what it is. So with these words and statements, thank you so much for motivating us and enlightening us. Now, I request the participants to come up with their queries. Professor Tapas Mandal, I can request you to unmute yourself and ask if it is comfortable for you. Professor Tapas Mandal? Okay, so I can ask on his behalf.
Yeah, just a moment. No. Hello, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
you can continue.
okay. Thank you very much, sir, for
But we can't see him. We can't see him though. Okay.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Can I interact?
हर्ष जी एक मिनट तपस जी पूछ रहे हैं तपस जी please continue.
maybe let him continue. I will just switch on the video. I'll make the camera ready.
Okay, Professor Harsh, you can continue then.
Thank you, Professor Gorshetty, and thank you, sir. It's really a very interesting talk and very enlightening.
Thank you,
Can
Dr.
Can you hear me, sir? This is
Oh,
Harsh.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I have one query. I mean, it's I would say it's curiosity. Can there be a comeback for Sterlite fiasco for India in the field of copper?
Why not?
So
Why
what should be done? I mean, we have
some stern and direct action. No, some stern and direct action by the central government. First, you please bring to book the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board. If there was pollution going on, what were they doing?
Because I can see one relevant thing in that in case of fabrics also, the clothes, the garments. So most of the things which we are purchasing in our own Indian market, it is coming from Bangladesh now, which used to come from Tamil Nadu earlier.
Correct.
So there
Correct.
also, there also
No,
it's
see,
a scene of pollution.
Dr. Chauhan,
Yeah.
sorry for interrupting, but
It's okay, sir. No,
the,
sir.
the Chinese are doing exactly the same thing for any product. They look at the weak spot. I mean, where was West Bengal and where was Bangladesh 20 years ago? Today,
Yes.
where is West Bengal and where is Bangladesh?
Bangladesh, exactly. Yes.
So, I mean, if we are not even able to make these obvious comparisons, you don't need to be some big PhD professor and all to understand these things. So, I mean, you asked about Sterlite. You ask the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board. You don't talk to the politicians because they will only do like, I mean, the DMK, ADMK. Whenever they were in power, they supported Sterlite. Whenever they came out of power, they opposed Sterlite.
So it's
So
saying
it is a typical they are not going to solve it. Ask the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board why they allowed these things to happen if really there was pollution. We still don't know that.
Exactly.
We don't know that. So suppose there was no pollution, then you catch all these Andolan GBs and ask them what they were protesting about. See, there has to be a stern action from the central government. It cannot, this is a state subject, this is a central subject, this is a concurrent list. And above all, the latest thing that is happening is let the Supreme Court decide. So, ये तो ठीक policy नहीं है. It is something, it is just passing the buck to here or something here and there. Sterlite and copper is a national strategic concern. We have been made not only lost a lot of money, but we have been made total fools of in this whole picture. So you ask me, can it be started? Yes, of course it can be started. It just requires
Yes,
political will to do that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So Tapas, you can continue. You can speak again.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, you're audible. You can continue.
Yeah.
Yeah, sir, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, it was very enlightening and wonderful, sir. I could get some of your points.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
So
you.
there was one question regarding this rare earth. There used to be one company called Indian Rare Earths, because I remember when I was working, I used to buy that rare earth oxides from Indian Rare Earths. So was it a nationalized company, or and later on I think they had
Was
lot
it?
of problems.
If I seem to
supplying
remember, was it
from
connected with the Department of Atomic Energy?
I am not sure.
Is it because the little bit of rare earth development that has happened in India? See, the one which we have the most of is the cheapest one, cerium. But cerium is also important enough. The problem with cerium is it occurs in these monazite sands in Kerala and in the west coast. And once it comes, those are all strategic compounds because they have thorium, which is used in the atomic energy thing. So most of the rare earth thing in India is subject to some kind of clearance from DAE. This is one of the reasons, again, a lot of bureaucracy. They should be able to de-link. Rare earths are, as I said, they're very common, they're everywhere. So routinely, this rare earth business should not go into the hands of DAE, because then it will go into a bureaucratic chakkar, which is, it'll never come out of that. I think Indian Rare Earths could have been, I'm not sure. I don't know whether it's a completely private. Which particular rare earth were you buying? Was it
because
cerium?
we are actually buying starting from lanthanum to lutetium and almost everything on the series, and I think when I was doing my PhD, we got fairly good supply. Later on, we realized like there was enormous delay.
So some of them were very costly now. See, but at small research level samples, I think you can always get. I don't think.
Yeah, no, that's not
finally
a
you can import it from China.
That's not a problem, but the concern was, as you said, that I mean the concern was like why the Indian Rare Earths or some other Indian company actually could not take up, because we also have a fairly good amount of resources of rare earth. As you said, the what the Chinese have done in terms of extracting metal and doing the chemistry and all this.
Dr. Mandal,
Yes.
please appreciate, you have to control the entire supply chain.
Mhm.
Firstly, we don't know where the rare earth is found. Second, the metallurgy is very dirty. Third, you need the plant to extract the pure metal. Fourth, you need to make the finished product.
Mhm.
Suppose you just export pure lutetium oxide or pure lutetium. You don't control everything because somebody will make the final application. The Chinese are making the TV sets, they are making the cigarette lighters, they are making the glasses, they are making the magnets. So you have to carry the supply chain right through. Only then you will get into a position of advantage. Can India do this? India can do this, but does India have the kind of planning capability to do this?
It's
Each
true.
one of these 4 steps will go into a different ministry. Imagine
Very
getting
true.
4
Yes.
ministries and their babus together.
Exactly. I mean, I think that has created some problem because see, even if you talk about research sample and some quantity now, because of this, we are losing this way that so even for small quantities of rare earths to buy and do some research, where you maybe have some kind of a technology or something coming out of research, but even that investment is becoming expensive. That's
No,
what I'm trying to
see,
mean.
Dr.
Like,
Mandal,
you
Dr.
did
Mandal.
lakhs.
See, everything will get affected. It's
Exactly.
not just one. The whole thing gets affected because, I mean, let's figure out. When they were a very poor country, Deng Xiaoping was able to understand the strategic importance of these things. He knew that the metallurgy is dirty. He knew that therefore USA, Australia, and others could only do it up to a point. And so that is why, the secret of any war,
Mhm.
this is all war only, this is not science. Secret of any war is to know your strengths and to know your weaknesses, to know the enemy's strength and to know the enemy's weaknesses. Sun Tzu says this also.
Right.
He says
Right.
if you know yourself and if you know the enemy, he says you have a good chance of winning the war. And finally, he says, if you don't know yourself and you don't know the enemy, he says you will certainly lose. He says all these things. See, I don't think we even know ourselves to know the enemy.
True.
And this is not chemistry, this is warfare. I'm talking.
Exactly. Now the other thing, sir, that is the corporate sector in India, or if I say the I'll say the mindset of the corporate sector in India. Okay, I can say that in recent times, probably we have little bit a different mentality or change, maybe, in last 5-10 years or so, I'm not sure. But, we don't find kind of an investment. If I see any American company or, in European, so people have invested in research, research and development, and they are waiting for 10 years, 15 years to get a turnout. So tomorrow you do a patent, suppose you have a patent and you just talk to a company that, okay, we want to do some more research on this to fine tune to the prototype and all this. And nobody would like to actually approach. They actually I want a finalized product from the academia, which I can market it tomorrow. Now, if you have this kind of a mindset,
I got your question. I got
Yes.
your question, Dr. Mandal.
Yes.
See, you are talking at a micro level. I cannot answer at micro level because these are specific problems. Macro level, what did I say? I said strategic interest must come before economic interest. This is true of the government. The government should be in a position to lose money by giving a lot of money direct and indirect to the industry. No academic will do it because this is not my work. It is not my work to produce a product, a prototype, and give it to some industry to make it. It is the industry's work, and industry will not do this unless the terms are very favorable to the industry. And these very favorable terms can be given only by the government.
Exactly.
So they have to be told that whether who is the secretary in the Department of Mines and who is the minister in the Department of Atomic Energy, whoever it changes, we are not going to change this policy. This is how much money we are going to give you. Either you give it, you don't give it like what they are doing now. Some only small fellows can come, they'll set up some park, we'll give a subsidy. Please wait, let me finish.
Right, sir.
And then you have to, the key of all this is big industries. Starting so many chota motas and saying we are going to help the small man, that is okay in some socialistic pattern of society. It is not okay in a war with China. The big industry has to be helped in big ways, and not by just saying subsidy in this, you are saying it at, you have to reduce some taxes in a big way. Government should be prepared to take that financial loss. And if you give sufficient amount of benefit to the industry, the scientists in industry are certainly good enough to be able to come out with a competitive thing. What the industry lacks today is not given any, it's held on a very tight leash by the government. You say, you this lanthanide thing, you start a survey. You start setting up plants to pull out all these things. We'll give you 3 years, but we'll give you a lot of money to do this. Choose your people properly. Don't choose a company just because he's your brother-in-law. See, so if a certain level of honesty is clubbed with a lot of money given, that is the only way to do it. And please don't put the burden on IITs and IISc and central universities, saying you produce a nice way of making lutetium from the ore. I mean, this is not our job, and nor are we equipped to do it also. So I think all these attempts at saying, you know, we will have academia can help industry and all this, I don't believe any of this stuff. It cannot, and it should not, and it need not. Our job is different. We have to train students. We have to train students for a better India tomorrow. You know, we have to give them enough pride in doing science in India and staying in India and not running away to America. That is our job. Not how to make lutetium from lutetium oxide. That is not our job for an industry. Okay. So please don't. You have asked at a very small level, but I've given a big level answer.
Because exactly, no, I understand, sir. I understand. But what I feel at some stage. So if I talk about the tomorrow's industry, so that has to be based on something of today's science. So this diplomacy also, I mean, it should also begin in a long-term plan wise way. It is not that tomorrow I plan, I will make and go.
Professor Mandal, tomorrow's industry doesn't even have to be based on today's science. Tomorrow's industry could easily be based on day before yesterday's science. True. That is how far back we are.
Okay.
Copper metallurgy में क्या है इतना sophisticated? कुछ भी नहीं. Human beings have been smelting copper for 3,000. It is the first element known to mankind in pure form. क्या है इतना अजीब बात copper metallurgy में? And that we are not able to do, and without that sulfur dioxide and arsenic leaking out. We are still not able to do that. I mean, this calls for, I mean, there's a difference between copper and lutetium. I hope you understand. Will appreciate that at least.
Yes.
Okay, if you cannot make lutetium, I'll say, all right, you know. You cannot make copper and keep the plant free of pollution. कुछ तो कुछ pollution तो जरूर था. Otherwise, they cannot, this agitation could not have become to the level it became.
Thank you, Mr. Devaraja. With your permission, can I go to next question?
Thank you very much, sir.
Please.
Yes, yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tapas. Now, Professor Jitin Singla is unable to ask because of some technical problem. His question is regarding this civilization state identity. How it is possible from academia or an academician terms, how to contribute to strengthen the civilizational state identity?
This is something that is very spontaneous. The people feel, you know, as I said, for me, the only direct, necessary and sufficient evidence are the majorities in the Lok Sabha. And tomorrow I will also say this. Any political party, I don't care what political party it is, if it doesn't capture the mood of the people correctly, it will lose. The whole role and duty of a political party is to understand and capture the mood of the people, especially in a parliamentary democracy like ours. And by the way, that's another challenge in a civilizational state. because one of the characteristics of a nation state is a democratic form of government. So how to run a civilizational state using certain adherence to democracy, fundamental rights and all that, because this is understood by Huntington also. In any civilizational state, the minorities will come under certain stress. And this is, China has solved that problem in a repressive way. But you see, luckily for us, our civilizational state doesn't arise so much from religion, but more from a way of thinking. Because our major religion is a very different type of religion. It is not a religion really in the sense of other religions. So that is why India as a civilizational state has lasted for so long. There was a very interesting report in this connection. It's not really to do with the question on academics, but I think what can academics do was a question. So maybe it is a good answer. Just 1 month ago, there was a very interesting report which is published by a group in America, correct? The Pew report.
Yeah.
The Pew report on religion of India. I'm so glad that you know it, and that means many of your colleagues will know it. But you see, the Pew sample is statistically significant. 28,000 people have been examined. And some of the most pleasantly surprising, I think many of us knew instinctively that most of us are conservative and tolerant. And we all know that. This is a conservative traditional country which is very, very tolerant. And this is not a usual combination according to the nation state idea. And India does not belong to a classification of right wing, left wing as defined by the nation states of the West. Nor do we belong to the classification of conservative liberal as defined by the nation states of the West, because many of us could be what are called right wing culturally and traditionally, and we could be left wing economically. This is very common in India. It is not rare. And the things, some of the numbers actually were quite startling. I would never have believed this, that the Pew report says it, and this is specifically to deal with the 200 million Muslims in this country. 63% of them believe that Indian culture is the best culture in the world. 63. A staggering 77% of Muslims in India believe in karma or some variation of the karmic theory. A surprising 27% of Muslims in India believe in reincarnation. Can you believe? 1/4 of all Muslims in India believe that the Ganga has magical curative properties. And the last one and the most surprising, the majority of Muslims in India feel that partition was a bad idea. Okay, so this is not what your TV news channels and Rajdeep Sardesai and Barka Dutt will have you to believe. Which means that what we are seeing in the media are extremely shrill viewpoints of the extreme right wing and extreme left wing, or whatever you want to call. If 77% of Muslims believe in that this is nothing to do with Islam, which means, and I think Pew himself says it, that Muslims in India are very different from Muslims in Bangladesh and Pakistan. So which means that it is once again the civilizational state coming in. It is the Indian civilization that influences strongly the thinking of people of both religions in this country. There is not much difference between Hindus and Muslims in the way in which we think about some very important things. Like both Hindus and Muslims feel that diet restrictions are very important. Not eating beef is more important than not going to a temple for Hindus. Similarly, not eating pork is more important than not praying 5 times a day for Muslims. Which means Hindus and Muslims in this country think very similar, and that is why I would like to differ from Huntington. He was thinking about religion. I don't believe that the civilizational state in India has too much to do with religion. I think Sanatana Dharma goes higher than religion. Religion is not even an Indian word. It is an English word which was simply, even Hinduism is not an Indian word. Hinduism word also is put in place only by the English people. The word is Sanatana Dharma. So this idea goes much higher than the religions that are practiced in India. And yet everybody in India thinks the same. And fact that the Lok Sabha majority is so huge. You please don't tell me Kerala is different, Bengal is different. They are different, they will always be different. In scientific words, they are outliers. They don't represent what the whole country as such thinks. Not for some of these things anyway. And even that may be a temporary phase. How do you know? So this moving towards, and what can academics do? I think academics can do things not with a shrill propaganda of this or that political viewpoint. I think we leave politics to the politicians. I think what we should do and we can do is that, especially in a place like IIT, have a good deal of constructive interaction between various kinds of departments. My examples today, all three had to do with chemistry. But was mine a chemistry talk today? Hardly. So I think you have to take this in a full picture, and I think the duty of academics is to give youngsters a clear idea of what this country is and what it can become. And I think because this is a country that is struggling to find itself. Why are our young people running away to America? Because they don't even understand themselves. Firstly, you don't understand yourself, then what can you do in any field of endeavor? You will get only 2 medals in the Olympics. 2 or 3 or 4, that is all within the estimated standard deviation. 0 plus or minus 5. Minus 5 medals is not there, so it will be plus 5, that's all. Or you want me to put 2 plus or minus 1, I can put like that also. But all this is within standard deviation. So we will only be in this sub-zero level if we don't know ourselves. And students are the people who should be told all this in a proper way. Not like how Barka Dutt and Rajdeep Sardesai are telling. If you believe them, it will be that they are going out in the streets and attacking each other with knives all the time. Nothing like this is happening. I think this is what academics can do, and they should do in a place like IIT. It's especially important. I mean, I hope some of the people even get to appreciate this China business a little bit more and realize it presents a real danger to us tomorrow. It's not just a case of, we all read our journals and all. What is the proportion of papers from China in any top journal that you read today? How many from India? Then?
Great. Thank you. One participant from YouTube, his name is Prabir. He has 2 questions. I think for one of the questions, he must have got the answer. The question is, many intellectuals praise India as an example of pluralism, but is it a bane for us? I hope the earlier answer given by Professor Desiraju might have answered this question.
It might have answered, but let me tell you, pluralism is one of these catchwords like secularism. It has been abused so much that what exactly, I want to ask, what is meant by pluralism? If the Muslims are thinking about Ganga and Karma, I think that is pluralism working for you. That means they feel comfortable, no? If a quarter of the Muslims feel that Ganga has a curative properties, and if 63% feel Indian culture is the best culture in the world, then it means that we already have pluralism here. What's the question? What's the second question that Mr. Praveen has?
Yeah. So can you comment on the future roles of so-called small European countries like UK, France, Germany, Italy, etc.? They are
I can
already
comment.
saturated with
No,
the
I can
aging
comment.
population.
Their role is all zero. They will become like Disneyland or amusement parks. We can go there and do tourism and other things. We can take photographs and all that. Only 3 countries will be there: USA, China, India. That's all. No other countries will be there. And I can also predict that USA is heading towards a civilizational type of model. They too are going to realize that this has only taken them that far. The divisions in that country are very, very deep, believe me. They are much deeper than the divisions in India. And I think the election of Mr. Trump and his failure to get re-elected last year, all these are only adding fuel to the flames. They are not improving matters any. And they also have a relatively weak president in charge. So I think my view is that among these 3 countries, it's going to be very, very interesting. Instead of talking about Quad, we can talk about Triad, which will be, see, all the 3 countries, nobody is a friend of anybody, nobody is an enemy of anybody, like that it will be. And we all have to live with each other. And India, this third, bronze medal wala, it will still be too big and too powerful for USA and China to ignore completely. They'll try to ignore, but beyond a point, they will not be able to ignore. All the European countries, I don't, all over, the century of Europe is over. It was over at the end of World War II. So they just had an artificial life for another 50 years.
Thank you, Professor Desiraju, for a nice interaction. Can I request Professor Sriram Yadav to deliver a vote of thanks? Professor Yadav?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Gauri Shetty. So on behalf of Institute Lecture Series Committee and IIT Roorkee, it is my honor to thank Professor Desiraju for his wonderful talk. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the audience who managed to attend the talk. It was indeed a wonderful interaction with you, sir. And thank to student volunteers who help us in organizing this talk. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot.